Several years after the Portuguese first explored Brazil, French traders in search of pau-brasil reached the rich area extending from the Cape Frio coast to the beaches and islands of Guanabara Bay, the economic and, above all, strategic importance of which was already well known. Overview. In 1555, one of the islands of Guanabara Bay, now called Villa-Gagnon Island, was occupied by 500 French colonists under Admiral Nicolas Durand de Villagagnon. Consequently, Villagagnon built Fort Coligny on the island when attempting to establish the France Antarctic colony, which the French called Henryville in honor of Henry II of France. The Portuguese wanted to expel the French from that part of the South American coast which had been granted to them by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The task was given to Estácio de Sá, a nephew of Gov. Mem de Sá of Brazil, who in 1565 occupied the plain between Dogface Hill and the Sugarloaf and Urca Mounts, thus laying the foundations of the future town of Rio de Janeiro. After 2 years of bloody battles, in which Estácio de Sá was killed and the French expelled, Mem de Sá chose a new site for the town, farther inland on the coast of the bay, at the top of the Hill of Rest, or St. Januarius Hill, later called the Castle Hill. In 1568, the settlement was laid out in the form of a medieval citadel, protected by a bulwark and cannons. The surrounding fertile land, allotted to Portuguese settlers by the Portuguese king in enormous plots called sesmarias, was planted with sugarcane, which was to provide the colony with its main source of income. In 1660 the community became the seat of the government of the southern captaincies of Brazil. In the second half of the 17th century, the captaincy population grew to 8,000 inhabitants, 2/3 of whom were probably African slaves and Indians. At the beginning of the 18th century, Brazil began to engage in gold and diamond mining, which brought about remarkable changes in the colony's economy and stimulated a great migration from Europe, thereby increasing the number of people of European ancestry. The former village became a town of 24,000 in 1749. When the colonial capital was transferred from Bahia to Rio de Janeiro in 1763, the town expanded far beyond its walls. The remains of the monumental Roman-style aqueduct Arcos built at this time still stand in the city. At the end of the 18th century, the town's economy, as well as that of the colony as a whole, was in a crisis because of the decline of the mines and competition from Central America for the world sugar market. In 1796, the value of exports from Rio's port was less than half of what it had been in 1760. Coffee production and the resettlement of the Portuguese royal family in Brazil in 1808 again brought prosperity to the colony. By 1815, when Brazil became a kingdom, Rio de Janeiro was large enough to accommodate a foreign population. At about the time the city's original appearance was being transformed, from 1808 to 1818 some 600 houses and 100 country houses were built, and many older buildings were restored. Many streets were lighted and paved, more land was reclaimed, new roads were opened, and new public fountains were installed. Among new institutions established were the Royal Press, the Royal Library, the Theatre of St. John, the Academy of Fine Arts, the Botanical Garden, and a Bank of Brazil. When King John VI returned to Portugal in 1821, Rio had almost 113,000 inhabitants and 13,500 buildings, and the town had extended both northward and southward. A year later Brazil was independent. Expansion of coffee plantations in the state of Rio de Janeiro gave a new impulse to the city's development. Nobles and bourgeois moved their residences north to the São Cristóvão district, Merchants and English bankers chose to live around the Outeiro da Glória and Praia de Flamengo areas in the south, or they established the residences in the nearby Botafogo and Laranjeiras districts. The French, on the other hand, lived in country houses scattered in the Tijuca area farther westward, in the Terra. As Brazil expanded its world export trade in such products as coffee, cotton, sugar, and rubber, the city changed its appearance, and the traces of its colonial past were effaced. In 1829 oxcart traffic was banned from the Rua do Uvador, then the city's most elegant street. In 1838 the first public transportation horse-drawn buses began to run to the districts of São Cristóvão, Engenho Velho, and Botafogo. In 1868 the first tramcars, also drawn by animals, were introduced. A steamboat service to Niterói began to operate in 1835. The first railroad was built in 1852 to Petrópolis, and a line reached Queimados in the Nova Iguaçu area in 1858. In 1854 gas replaced oil for street lighting, and wireless telegraphy was inaugurated. Sewerage was installed in 1864, and telephone service began in 1877. When Rio de Janeiro, which had formerly been the capital of the empire, became capital of the Republic of Brazil in 1889, it was already a considerable community. At the time of the 1890 census, it had more than 520,000 inhabitants on 61 square miles, ranking it as the largest city in Brazil and one of the largest cities in the world. The 1891 Constitution designated it the Federal District. During the federal administration of Pres. Francisco de Paula Rodrigues Alves, from 1902 to 1906, Rio de Janeiro was further transformed. A team of administrators and technicians drained swamps, cleared slums, paved and widened streets, and markedly improved health conditions, notably by reducing cases of yellow fever and smallpox. The Central Avenue, still the most important of the center, was opened during that period. Avenida Beira Mar, running parallel to part of the South Shore, was built on reclaimed land, and several other important avenues were opened. The population of the Federal District exceeded 1 million by 1920 and increased to 1,750,000 by 1940. During that period the number of industrial establishments in the Federal District nearly trebled. Castle Hill was demolished, land reclamation increased the area in the center, and the first skyscrapers appeared. Streetcar lines, now moved by electrical power, multiplied, while settlement spread on the east coast. Some areas to the north lost status, such as São Cristóvão, which became an industrial and lower-class residential neighborhood. In the mid-20th century, metropolitan Rio de Janeiro grew beyond its formerly narrow confines because of migration from other parts of Brazil, as well as a high rate of natural increase. The suburban population more than tripled to some 1.5 million between 1940 and 1960, at a time when the city proper exceeded 3.3 million. Following the transfer of the national capital to Brasilia in 1960, Ria's rate of population growth slowed somewhat, although the suburban population continued to mushroom. By 1980 there were more than 5 million residents in the city and 3.6 million in the suburbs, although subsequent growth continued at a lesser rate. By the early 21st century the metropolitan population exceeded 11 million, of which nearly half resided in the suburbs. Beginning in the latter part of the 20th century, population growth, real estate speculation, and an amplified dependence on automobiles precipitated a series of changes in the city. The highway system was expanded, with improved access to numerous suburban areas. Still higher skyscrapers arose in the center, and larger residential towers increasingly replaced southwest. Small apartment buildings and houses. Landowners, the industrial sector and the financial sector favor the changes. However, higher rents forced many poorer residents to move from the central city to the periphery or to the rapidly expanding favelas on the steeper hillsides. Meanwhile, many affluent families settled in the southwest, notably in Ipanema and Leblon and its sites farther down the coast. Rio has maintained its status as the second largest manufacturing center in Brazil, after São Paulo. In addition, Rio's service sector remains one of the strongest in the country, providing for increasing numbers of jobs in such areas as finance, communications, tourism and entertainment, public and private education, and computer engineering. Rio remains a major center for cultural exhibitions and international conferences, and many of the more affluent and influential Brazilians keep homes there. Despite desperate conditions in the city's favelas, as well as high rates of violent crime throughout the city, grave levels of air and water pollution, and myriad other problems, Rio de Janeiro is still widely recognized as one of the world's more beautiful urban centers.